Du débat, the Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise this evening to speak to the main estimates for 2022, 2023. And I want to start by talking a little bit about climate change and the importance of the government taking a leadership role in charting an economic path from where we are today to where we need to be, both in order to lower emissions and to try and avert the worst of what's coming with climate change in the climate crisis. That continues to be, or it must be, I'm not always convinced that it is the priority that it needs to be around here, but it has to be a priority. And that economic course is important not only to mitigate the economic and the very real human effects that climate change will bring, but it's also important because it's about securing a prosperous future for Canadians in an economy that is changing. If you look around the world, there are a lot of countries that are accepting the reality of climate change and that are trying to transition their economies away from such a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. We've seen the importance of that from a climate change point of view, but of course recently we've seen the importance of trying to transition away from fossil fuels from a defense and security point of view too. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has shown just how fragile the world economy is in the face of its reliance on fossil fuels. So trying to develop energy alternatives that are closer to home, and we're fortunate in Canada to have many ways that we can do that and many resources that can enable a transition away from such heavy fossil fuel reliance. So there's certainly more than one reason. I don't even pretend to have captured them all. And when we talk about the government spending plan, what we saw in the budget was a commitment, first of all, to about $2.6 billion for carbon capture and sequestration, which I think is a bad bet, given where, not only in terms of the success of the technology at scale, which many experts have called into question, it's a bad bet in terms of emissions reductions as well. Like, it's just not where we should be spending the lion's share of public funds that are meant to transition the economy away from reliance on carbon. In fact, because it's designed to not be transitioning away from reliance on carbon. It's meant to find ways to perpetuate that reliance, which I think is still a form of climate denial that is going to do a fair bit of harm. So we saw already in the budget that I don't think the government has understood the severity of the crisis. I don't think they're at a place where they're going to invest in the right options. It was very disappointing to see that, particularly in the context of a government that had committed to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, not increase them. So that's one area of government spending in respect of climate change that I think it's important to highlight, and that I want Canadians to know that the government is, I think, making a serious mistake in respect of. Then I would add to that, if you look at the budget still, when we're talking about investment in renewable energy, where they want to land that is in the infrastructure bank, which means they want to capitalize the bank for a lot of renewable energy projects. That's what they say. But I think part of the issue is that in so doing, they're handing it off to an organization that has a very bad track record so far on delivering on projects. So it doesn't give one a lot of hope to know that the infrastructure bank is on the case. They haven't delivered a lot of projects. To the extent that their successful project list has increased, and I'm sure somebody will want to quote some high numbers at me later, it's largely been around bus purchasing, which I think is great, and it's an important part of it. But I mean, we don't need an infrastructure bank, and we don't need to pay former Liberals high salaries in order to figure out how to source electric buses. This is something that we already know how to do, something municipalities were doing before the infrastructure bank, thank you very much, and it's something that they could continue to do without the infrastructure bank, and perhaps more effectively if it meant that we didn't have to go through another layer of administration and pay the salaries of of government cronies over at the infrastructure bank, if I'm being honest about what I think about it anyway, Madam Speaker. But the other, I think, intentional or unintentional, I don't know, Madam Speaker, I don't think it matters, consequence of running that funding through the infrastructure bank, and I would impress upon you again, we don't have, it's not like there's a lot of evidence that it's worth it because the infrastructure bank is so great at delivering projects on time and on budget. The other consequence is that those projects that might have appeared in an estimate, that might have appeared somewhere here on the floor of the House of Commons to give parliamentarians and through their representatives, Canadians, an opportunity to weigh in on the key nation-building projects that really ought to be part of our response to climate change and drive our transition to a low-carbon economy, won't grace the floor of the House. Because instead, that money will be set aside at some point, perhaps in an estimate, one time, and then those debates will be happening internally at the infrastructure bank, and municipal governments will be talking to the infrastructure bank, not our duly elected government or parliamentarians for that matter. And so I think there's a real loss of democratic involvement that happens in the way that the government is projecting the delivery of those funds, and something that I think is a mistake. I think of my colleague from Manitoba who represents the riding of Churchill-Kawatanukaski, who's done some great work on the, and presented a private member's bill to try and change the nature of the infrastructure bank, which I think is a good thing, but that work is not done. That bill is not passed. The infrastructure remains largely as it was originally set up by the Liberals, and not doing the job that I think was advertised in the 2015 election when this government initially ran on the idea of having an infrastructure bank. So I think if we're going to successfully transition the economy to a lower carbon economy, that is also an opportunity to engage Canadians who are wondering a lot about their future right now, who are wondering a lot about how they're going to afford a home, how they're going to get the education they need to get a job that's actually out there in the market. We hear a lot from employers right now who are saying they can't find qualified people to do the jobs that they need done in order for their businesses to succeed, in order for their customers here in Canada and abroad to get the products and the services that they want. And I think what we want as we think about serious public investment in the economy to respond to climate change is we should also be having a process that brings more Canadians into that conversation and helps them get some direction over the kinds of employment that we're going to see and the pathways to that employment as well. And I think running the lion's share of the funding for new renewable infrastructure projects through the infrastructure bank is a real missed opportunity to foster that kind of engagement and participation on the part of Canadians. I would point out that another major spend by government is not in the estimates, and that's the recent loan guarantee of $10 billion in addition to what had already been committed for the TMX pipeline. That's because that expenditure, and I don't think anyone should kid themselves, it is an expenditure. It's a commitment of public funds above and beyond what had already been budgeted. I think around $15 billion already, maybe a little bit more, plus 10 now. So we're getting close to the $30 billion mark for those who are keeping track. And because that happened through the Canada account of Export Development Canada, it doesn't appear on the books here. That's a decision that Cabinet got to make off in the corner, as they did when they initially purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline. When you think about the kind of Mackenzie Pipeline debates of the 1950s and what a watershed moment that was for the country and for Parliament, I think it's a real it's a real disappointment, and I think that's an understatement, Madam Speaker. I'm feeling very parliamentary at the moment. It is disappointing that the government chose to fund that project in that way for all sorts of reasons, because it's the wrong project at the wrong time. It doesn't take us in the right direction in terms of the economy for the future, but also because it circumvented this place. And we do talk a lot about pipelines in this place, and I've got my own views on that. I've been pretty open about that. People could search the record in terms of what I think about pipelines. I think I've given you probably enough that you could read the tea leaves already here, Madam Speaker, and I know that others disagree, and fine. I mean, Parliament is a place where disagreement comes to live. And if we're doing our job well, hopefully we can tackle some of those real disagreements and we can find some common ground. And on the things that we can't, we can't. But at the very least, something like the federal government buying an existing pipeline and committing now, as I say, close to $30 billion, certainly 25, in order to get this thing built, is a major national undertaking, whether I agree with it or not, and whether others like it or not. I think it would be outrageous for someone to claim that A, that's not a major national expense and that it doesn't have major national implications for down the road. And because of the way the government chose to fund it, they could have tried to fund it through an estimate, but they didn't. They decided to circumvent Parliament instead and make that decision on their own. And I think that was wrong in terms of how they chose to make that decision, independently of the fact that I think the decision is wrong. We're hearing already, I mean, why was TMX even up for sale? Not just the existing pipeline, but the projected future pipeline. It was because a large company in the oil and gas sector that's very good at building pipelines decided it was a loser. If they thought they were going to make money on that thing, they'd have hung on to it. They decided that they were going to lose a lot of money, so they put it up for sale. And who came knocking? The federal government, of all people. A government that ran on getting serious about tackling the climate crisis. A government that has since many times repeated, but not often actually acted, on reducing fossil fuel subsidies. And we know, and we're reading, just like everyone else in the media, about where this project is headed, the massive cost overruns. We know that when the government says we're going to provide loan guarantees and that that's not public funding, that that's a sham, because one of two things is going to happen, Madam Speaker. Either the project is going to be a wild success and it's going to make a lot of money for the private investors that are kicking in cash with no risk because the government has already underwritten those loans, in which case, true, there won't be a public expenditure. There'll be a lot of happy private investors. But in the case where that goes wrong, it is a public expenditure because the government is going to step in and cover the loans. And the private investors are going to walk off scot-free without ever having taken a meaningful risk. Well, I don't know. To me, that sounds worse than public expenditure. At least if the government spent the money itself and it was entitled to the profit and it was successful, they'd make income off it. But actually what the government has said, the only thing for sure that they're not going to do is make a lot of income off that project. Because if it's a success, the private investors are going to walk away with the return. And only if it's a failure are Canadians going to pay the bill. So I think it's a completely wrong-headed project anyway. But I'm glad to take this opportunity to talk about it in the context of the estimates because it's not there. And it really ought to have been a parliamentary conversation. And I wish that we had had a better debate about that before the decision was taken. In fact, it was announced as a surprise. I remember reading about it on my phone, walking up to the Hill one morning, that the government had decided to do this. So quite a disappointment, actually, Madam Speaker. And I say that by way of just trying to remind people of the importance and the significance I think this place can have, and sometimes does. But these kinds of circuitous funding routes are ways that government, the executive, minimizes the role of this place and keeps away important decision-making from this place and also important national conversations. So we have taken up the question of the TMX pipeline. And I don't just mean the NDP. I mean in this place. We've heard about it from all sides of the House in their various ways during question period. But there really ought to have been a time for a better and more focused debate, and it shouldn't just be in 35-second snippets in question period that we're trying to make sense of this major decision with import not only for Canada, but when we talk about climate change, we have to talk about the global context. And I think that's a decision that actually has import far beyond Canada's own borders. So I wanted to raise that as an example of something that is a government expenditure, but not in the estimates, that really ought to have been in the estimates. And I want to talk a little bit more generally, I suppose, having addressed some of the features of the estimates, both in terms of its content and absence, about where I believe government spending and government intervention in the economy has to go, because we have seen a lot of big numbers announced from this government. And I think, unfortunately, too often, this is a government that conflates spending announcements with real action on things. New Democrats often are accused by others of wanting to spend everybody else's money. And it's always kind of implied that we do this frivolously, Madam Speaker, which simply isn't the case. I mean, we're here to talk about how we can invest in Canadians and how we can invest in the country. I would say that we don't think of return on investment as being solely a financial question. So, if we pool our resources as Canadians and we find a more efficient way to pay for prescription drugs, or we pool our resources and we make sure that not just my kids, but every kid in the country gets access to dental care, to me, that's a return on investment. In respect of pharmacare, I think there is a financial return that we can realize as Canadians against what we're already paying for prescription drugs. We know a number of studies have been out, and the most small c, conservative estimates on how much we can save is in the order of about $4 billion a year. We already spend, and I mean, this is dated information. Of course, we're living in a period of great inflation. I'm sure the numbers have gone up, but I bet that the differential hasn't. So, back when the PBO reported on pharmacare, he said Canadians were spending about $24 billion a year on prescription drugs, and one national prescription drug insurance plan would cost about $20 billion. Well, that's a savings of $4 billion. There's a very concrete financial return on an investment out of the public purse. But we can also measure return on investment in other ways. Government spending to build new housing supply so that we can house people that currently are living on the street brings return on investment. It brings return on investment. Again, that's another one where I'd say there is actually a financial component, because we know that people who are experiencing homelessness have more frequent interactions with the justice system, are more likely to end up in jail. We know that jailing people is expensive. We also know that they're more likely to end up in the health system, and not through preventative care, like your typical, physical at the doctor's office, but in the emergency room, where the issues are more acute, but also the costs are much higher. And so that's a return on investment. But when we talk about people that are nervous about taking the bus because there's people that have set up their home in the bus shelter and they don't know what those folks are like, they don't know what state of mind they're in, and they're getting nervous about taking the bus, and they say, we need to get these people out of the way. Well, creating that sense of safety in our community by housing those folks, instead of waiting until something goes sideways and the police show up and arrest them, is another way that we can realize tangible return on investment. And that's something that we can do together through our governments that no individual can do on their own. And I think as we think about what was required in the pandemic as a response, as we think about the ongoing and mounting challenge of climate, we have to revisit the conventional wisdom of the last 30 or 40 years around public involvement in the economy, and recognize that if we're going to get to where we need to be, then we do need some bold public investment. But it should be happening in a way that allows it to be discussed in this place with public deliberation, instead of at the boardroom table of the infrastructure bank, or at the cabinet table in secret spending out of the Canada account, instead of doing it transparently here in the estimates, Madam Speaker. And I think even, if you consider the oil and gas industry, which right now, I think, is in a moment where that industry has had its heyday, and we need to figure out how to have a lower carbon economy. That industry in Alberta was built with tons of public investment. I mean, that economic engine didn't actually happen just with the private industry on its own. There were years of publicly funded research and publicly funded infrastructure at the provincial and federal level that led to that economy being what it became. And it's going to take that level of seriousness and public investment to build the economy of the future that provides good paying jobs and prosperity for Canadians again, which is why it's important that this place get it right when it comes to how we evaluate government spending. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to bring up an issue that this member talked about, and I've heard quite a bit from the NDP over the last several months, and that's with respect to fossil fuel subsidies. I don't disagree with the NDP. I don't disagree with this member. In my own personal opinion, I would love to see fossil fuel subsidies end tomorrow. I'm on the same page with them as that. But where I have a problem with their narrative is when they start saying that fossil fuel subsidies have increased. Where they're getting this information from is because during the pandemic, the federal government decided to invest money into dealing with abandoned orphan wells. That's where the money went. You know, these are wells that have been abandoned for either provincial regulations weren't there to deal with them, or the companies no longer exist. And the federal government has stepped in and said, we will take some of the responsibility of dealing with these wells. Now, can the member really suggest, I know it plays the narrative that the NDP like to purport in the House about the subsidies going up, but does the member really think that spending money on dealing with abandoned orphan wells, which is incredibly important environmentally, is really a subsidy to the oil sector?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I would say two things in response to that. The first is that the new $2.6 billion that was just announced in the budget for carbon capture and sequestration, I consider to be a fossil fuel subsidy. That's a major increase in fossil fuel subsidies that has nothing to do with orphan wells. I do think that it's a good idea to clean up orphan wells. I think that the industry should be made responsible to do it. And one of the proposals that we have to do that indirectly is to take the surtax that the government has agreed in our supply and confidence agreement to apply to banks and insurance companies and do what we've also been calling on them to do that they wouldn't initially agree to, which is to apply that to oil and gas companies so that they can pay the bill for the orphan well cleanup. There's more than one way to do this, but for government to just assume that responsibility and have Canadians pay the cost of cleanup that industry should have been paying all the way along is not right.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think what we saw there is like a WWE fight. It's not real, that last exchange, because while the honourable member stands up and talks about his disappointment in the government, the reality is the only reason the government's able to do any of the spending that he decries is because his party is supporting the government. Now, I will ask a very specific question in an area that the government's not spending money on, and I'm curious to hear his thoughts. The government made a promise, the Liberal Party made a promise during the election campaign to fund Canada Mental Health Transfer, $250 million last year, $625 million this year. That was the promise that the Liberal Party made during the election campaign. Since that election campaign, they cut a deal with the NDP, and now when it comes to the spending of the government, that money's not there. I'm wondering if the honourable member can tell us what the NDP negotiated into the budget in order to get their support and traded away against the promised funding for the Canada Mental Health Transfer.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I think the member knows full well that we don't have an NDP government here. And things would be very different if we did. So, you know, things haven't gone the way they did because we cut an agreement. The reason that the government is able to spend what it's going to spend is because Canadians elected a parliament. And like it or not, I don't even like the voting system that helped them get the most amount of seats. The member will know, I believe the Conservatives actually got more popular vote than these guys. But they got more seats because of a system that Conservatives endorse and defend. So what happened was Canadians elected a parliament, and unless we're going to be in a perpetual election cycle, some of us have to act like grown-ups and try and work together here instead of throwing tantrums all the time. So that's what happened. What's in the agreement reflects what we could get the Liberals to agree on in the agreement. The main thing for us was dental care. And I do think it's a shame that they're not living up to their commitment on mental health. And you will hear us continue to press them on those things as we would have if we were not in a supply and confidence agreement. What we got in the agreement were the things we could move forward on, and we secured our right to continue to go after them on the things that aren't in the agreement.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments?
Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On the topic of carbon capture that's in the budget, it's actually $7.1 billion between now and 2030. On the Trans Mountain Pipeline that the member for Elmwood Transcona also spoke about, it's $21.4 billion is what the costs of the project have doubled to, even before the $10 billion loan guarantee. He spoke about engaging Canadians. Well, the Council of Canadians, for example, has been doing just that, engaging Canadians across the country in what it would look like to have a prosperous or just transition that would include retraining and career supports for workers, jobs transfers, income supports, pension bridging. I wonder if the member for Elmwood Transcona could elaborate on what this could look like if we could move past the bickering about the fossil fuel subsidies and move towards what we have to do, which is invest those funds in a prosperous transition for workers.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
I was really fortunate to do my electrical apprenticeship at a time when the province of Manitoba, under an NDP government, as it happens, was investing a lot in public infrastructure. And I never missed a beat between working and going to school to finish my levels and then coming back out onto the job site. And I never did work on a fossil fuel project. There are a lot of different ways that government can invest in public infrastructure that are going to create jobs and prosperity for Canadians. So this dichotomy between investing in fossil fuel and having jobs and not doing that and losing all the jobs is simply that. It's a false dichotomy because that's not the real choice. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of things that we can invest in that are going to create good employment for Canadians. For somebody being from Western Canada, I mean, the Canada West Foundation, which is not usually a place where New Democrats look for inspiration, has done a great report on the idea of a Western power grid that would connect BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and allow the hydropower of BC and Manitoba to act effectively as a battery for Alberta and Saskatchewan, who have the most potential for wind and solar power generation in the country by far. But because that doesn't give you your base load, you need another kind of base load power that you can release into the system when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. We could create a really effective system of generation, transmission, and distribution in Western Canada that would help lower our emissions, create tons of employment, have the same nation-building capability as a pipeline that actually crosses more provinces than your typical pipeline does. And that's a way that we can be creating employment and moving our economy in the right direction, not only for here in Canada, but developing expertise with Canadian workers and Canadian companies that they can then go and sell globally as other economies make similar investments in renewable energy. That's how we can develop a plan for prosperity here in Canada that's actually equal to the climate crisis. It's not the vision that we're getting out of this government.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton with Wetaskiwin.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, it was interesting to hear the honourable member's response to my last question. First of all, I like the honourable member. I like the way he carries himself in the House. I take issue with his characterization of my raising mental health as an issue as a tantrum. I would ask that the honourable member talked about the priorities that the NDP negotiated into the spending of the government. It was one of the highest spending budgets we've ever seen in this country. And if the mental health of Canadians can't factor into the highest spending budget in Canadian history, when will it factor into the list of NDP priorities?
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I'm happy to clarify that I wasn't labeling his previous intervention as a tantrum. I was referring more so to the totality of question period interventions we see from his party, with perhaps the odd exception. So there's my charitable moment, Madam Speaker, in respect of Conservative performance in question period. And as I say, I mean, there are a lot of things that I would have loved to have seen in that agreement. Sure. But we can only get in what we can agree to move forward on with another party. And so I share his frustration that the government hasn't made this a priority. I'm happy to criticize the government of that. I would like to replace this government with a majority NDP government that will do those things In the meantime, we were able to get agreement on what I think is a very significant step forward, providing dental care to Canadians who have a household income of $90,000 or less, among other things. But I see Madam Speaker wants to move to the next intervention, and so I'm out of time.